Now we're ready for the last step in making a bead crochet bracelet, which is sewing the ends together. So you'll see I have a nearly completed tube here. There are just 5 beads left, one final round to crochet on, which I will do relatively quickly. And as I do this, one of the things that you will notice is that when you've got a long tube like this, just managing the tube itself becomes a little bit more of a pain. So it's more of a struggle to kind of rotate it around when you've got all these beads dangling from it. But same process as throughout the length of the tube, and we are getting up to the final bead. So I insert my hook into the red bead, push it back, and here is the very last red bead being crocheted on, and now we are out of beads. So what I'm going to do now is wrap the yarn back to front with no bead, because there are none, and just pull it through that last loop. So that's how you fasten off in crochet. And now I'm going to pull out a nice long tail and cut off the yarn and pull that last stitch through. And so now we have a complete tube that is all ready to be sewn shut. Now, if you look closely at the top of the tube, you'll see that these last 5 beads are still in the car tire position. So it's actually sewing the 2 ends together that is going to push these 5 beads back into the flat position that they need to be in. So you'll see that as we actually do the sewing process. Now, you see we have these 2 tails here. Most but not all bead crocheters that I've met use the end tail. I actually prefer to use the beginning tail, and so that's what I'm going to demonstrate. I just find that it looks better when I do that, but the process is very similar if you use the end tail instead. So I'm going to go ahead and thread that. Actually, let me clear this yarn out of the way because we don't need that anymore. And I will thread that beginning tail in preparation for sewing these ends together. Now, for this simple 5 spiral pattern, you're just going to want to, hold the ends together in the most natural way and sew it shut. But if you've got a more complicated pattern, this is the point at which you'll consider possibly twisting the pattern around to get different visual effects. And we actually have a lot about this question of twisting in the book. But in this case, we're just going to hold the ends together in the most natural way. And you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 initial chain stitches, and the yarn is effectively attached to the first chain bead on the end that I'm going to be sewing with. And by the same token, we've got our 5 final beads at the other end. But in both of these ends, we've got a little notch, right? So for example, in the chain end, we've got the purple bead just after the chain is down below our first bead, and there's a notch just below the last bead that we crocheted on, and those 2 notches will fit together when we sew it shut. So we're going to be sewing back and forth to emulate what this would look like if we crocheted past the point where the bracelet ends. And now we're ready to start that process. So as I mentioned before, the yarn is already attached to this initial purple chain bead. We are now going to stitch into the final purple bead. So we're going to stick the needle through from the inside of the tube to the outside, just like we did with the crochet hook. And similarly, just as we did with the crochet hook, we are now going to push the bead back behind the needle. So that's how that bead gets pushed back into place. And when we pull the yarn through, the stitch that we just made with the needle is going to hold that purple bead flat. Right? And you'll note another nice thing about the 5 spiral pattern, at the closing this continues to be color coded. So we just sewed purple to purple, now we're going to sew blue to blue, and this blue bead in the chain is already flat, so we're just sticking the yarn through to catch that loop of thread, and now we go into the final blue bead, and once again we stick the needle under and push the blue bead back behind the needle just as though it were the crochet hook, and then we pull that taut. And you can see that this join is starting to come together now. So now we're going to sew into the yellow chain bead, and again that's already flat, so we're just catching the yarn that's holding it. And then into the final yellow bead, once again pushing it back behind the crochet hook, needle so that it lies flat. And this is a good point at which to look at the join and see if it looks like it needs to be tightened. If it's looking really off, you can just pull out the stitches that you've already made and start sewing again. But this is looking fine. So we'll just get that tail out of the way. It does like to get in the way, the ending tail. And now we're going to sew under the orange chain bead. And hang on. Making sure that we catch just that loop of yarn. I was catching something else there. And we're going to go into the final orange bead, pushing it back into the flat position, into the red chain bead. And now the final red bead, that's the very last bead we crocheted. It's the last one that needs to be pushed flat. So there it is. And now you see this purple bead here, it's just below the initial chain, and it's the one that's right next to the red chain bead. That's where we secure the yarn so that we sew down the other side of that final red bead, ideally without dropping the needle. So once we have that caught and pulled through, that final red bead is secured on both sides and everything is in place. So there's one final step that I like to do, and as far as I know, no other bead crocheters do this unless they learned it from me. But I find that when I'm done, that last purple bead that we stitched into and this red bead that's kind of directly above it in the tube, they tend to be farther apart than they would normally be. Their holes, which are facing each other, should be a little bit closer together. So I like to put a little extra stitch that brings them closer. So you see how the yarn went down through the purple bead? We're just going to stitch it back up through that red bead with the facing hole. And that helps to pull them a little bit closer together. And now, having done that, I'm ready to weave the end in to hide it in the middle of the tube. So I'm going to pull the thread in the direction that pulls that red bead down the way I want it, in this case to the left. And I'm just going to fiddle to find a space between the stitches. And I'm pulling the yarn through the hollow center of the tube and bringing it out between stitches again. Right? So we're just going to do that a few times to secure the end in so it doesn't come out. You want to make sure that you don't have any exposed loops when you do that, so you're going to insert fairly close to where you got it out. And then the other thing you want to be careful about is that when you bring it out, you want it to come out between beads. So you see how this is actually poking through that purple bead? Right, it's going right through it. You do not want that. In this bracelet, it would make that bead sit funny. If you're working with small seed beads and thread, you will shatter the seed bead, and neither of these are good things. So you want to make sure that you always bring your yarn out between stitches, right? And mostly it's just running through the hollow space in the middle of the tube. So you do that a few times until the end is reasonably secured, and then you're ready to sew the other end in. So we're going to thread the final end of the yarn onto the needle. And at this final end, there's an extra little kind of bump of yarn from when we made that final fastening off stitch. So usually the first time that I pull through, I'll pull straight front to back to help that pop back into the tube. Now, with yarn like this, that has a lot of friction, you can just start weaving the end in like I did before. But what can be helpful with thread, which is much more slippery, is to make a little knot to help hold it into place. And so I guess you can't really see what I'm doing here, but I'm holding, let me reposition this. I'm holding this knot down so that I can make this knot as close to the beads as possible. And so you see I've made that little knot in the yarn, and now this time when I pull the yarn back, I'm going to pull it, and that knot is going to pop behind the stitches and help hold it into shape. In fact, when you're using thread with the smaller, tighter stitches, you can sometimes actually hear the little pop. And so that just helps to make everything more secure. To be perfectly honest, I've actually stopped doing that myself, even on the seed bead bracelets. It's not strictly essential as long as you weave the end in far enough. So for a seed bead bracelet, I'll usually go in, maybe half a dozen times. Oops, almost caught that orange bead. So that the thread is going most of the way around the bracelet. And then it's secure enough that even if the last little bit of thread comes out, you can just snip it off, and there's a ton of it secured inside the bracelet. So in this case with the yarn, I think that is plenty good enough. And so now we're ready to cut off the ends. And the other thing that I like to do to make sure that the end is secured inside, I'll figure out which direction it's pulling in, and I'll tug this a little bit. You can actually feel the beads compress a bit when you do that. And then I'm going to snip a little bit away from the tube, like maybe a 1/4 inch, and then pull the beads out, and that end will just retract right into the tube. So you've got this nice long secured end that's not poking out. So on the other side, again, I'm going to tug this a little bit, cut it a little bit away from the beads, and then pull everything out so that the end retracts in. And voila, there you are. That is a bracelet with an invisible join. So there is the whole process from beginning to end. I hope that you found these videos helpful. Happy beading!